Welcome to One Day in Transformation, the human side of global change. I'm Antje.
And I'm Rainer. And today, I have to admit, today's a very special and a little personal topic to me.
Because you actually know this guest, right? Like you really know him.
I do. And it's not just a guest. Scott and I first met when I was globally responsible for communication systems at Siemens, and he was at C-level at Logitech, reporting directly to Bracken, the CEO at that time. And we ended up in sharing a stage then in Davos 2 years ago, which for the record was my first World Economic Forum panel. And now this year, in January, Scott was back for his fifth consecutive time on stage.
So he's
That's right.
basically responsible for your entire reputation, Rainer?
Well, a bit, yes. Without Scott, I wouldn't have been any kind of reputation on the World Economic Forum. But that's not why he's here tonight. He's here because he's doing something genuinely important and genuinely brave. While the current US administration is rolling back climate commitments, pulling IRA funding, and slapping 145% tariffs on Chinese solar panels, Scott Wharton is raising $50 million to build the next generation of solar technology on American soil with perovskite in Silicon Valley. And he's doing it loudly, in public, on stage, at the UN Davos Summit this year in January, and on social media, despite the headwinds.
Scott Wharton, CEO of Tandem PV, serial entrepreneur, Yale-trained psychologist turned tech executive, 5 times Davos speaker, and one of the most clear-spoken voices on renewable energy in the United States right now. Scott, it's wonderful to have you here.
Yeah, fantastic to be here. Especially love the topic, love the idea of meeting you and being here with Reiner again.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's a pleasure to have you here in that round and talking to you. And I'm super curious now. You're in San Francisco in the Bay Area, and I think it's already spring, which arrived there. I mean, it never turns something else but spring and summer, I guess, right?
Well, February is kind of spring. It was almost 20 degrees Celsius yesterday, so that's our winter here in California. Sorry, guys.
I'm a bit jealous now, to be honest, because we have, well, it's getting better, but it's still, I think, 5 degrees or 6 degrees and windy, and we've had a lot of snow just over the weekend. But yeah, jealous that it's already that.
Scott, so let's start at the beginning because your path is generally unusual. Psychology and economics at undergrad, Yale MBA, then via IP, then video collaboration at Logitech, then solar. What is the thread that connects all of that? Was it always about technology or is it something else?
Well, I think the thread for me is that I like innovation, and usually I like being on the cutting edge of things. So if you look at the thread of all these things, these are my fifth startup and scale up in a row, and I like, I would say, taking things that people say are impossible to do and making them possible, and then turning them into reality. And I think that's part of the fun part. Maybe joke is that I've got a little bit of a chip on my shoulder growing up, where I didn't grow up. My parents were public school teachers in New York City, so I didn't grow up with a lot of means. We weren't poor either; we were middle class, but moving into a world where I think there are a bunch of people who take things for granted. And for me, it was the idea of proving myself and maybe proving to other people things they said that I couldn't do that I was able to pull off. So that's maybe part of the fun part.
It's excellent. Is there a moment where you realized the skills you did build exactly at that time is what you needed then there? Or is that something which turned out later?
I think there were a few of them. When I was 8, my mother took me to this beach resort in the New York City area, and all of my friends were on the beach having fun. What I decided to do is I had one of these little red wagons, and I would wait for people to come off the ferry, and I would charge them money to carry their luggage, and I would use that money for video games. So even at that time, I was an entrepreneur, building my own business and trying to control my own destiny. And then when I was in college, I did an internship around Earth Day, one of the milestone Earth Days, where I won the best internship out of 100, where I basically created an Earth Day project both for my school and for the city that I was going to school in. And I think what I realized that I love being an entrepreneur and putting things together from scratch. I think there are a bunch of things like that, but those were, I think, formative experiences that told me that I want to be an entrepreneur and like building things.
And we'll come to that in a later point as well with a question, because you did not just once time build a business, but you did that multiple times. So that's definitely something we'll maybe jumping to your time at Logitech. where you took the video collaboration division from a standing start to over 1 billion in revenue. And I mean, that's extraordinary numbers. What did you experience teach you about scaling and how you're applying it now in a hardware startup in one of the toughest industries on earth?
I think I learned a few things. One is that it was my first opportunity to be an entrepreneur. So take my entrepreneurial skills and say, can you apply it within a big company? And I think what I learned is that a lot of those same skills apply, building coalitions and hiring great people. But we're probably also more importantly, a lot of people at large organizations, as both of you know, are very smart, but usually they're more risk averse. So the fact that I was less more risk tolerant, and I was willing to do that and had a boss in Bracken that was willing to support me. I think that gave me a superpower in order to build something up even internally that I didn't really realize I could do. In fact, when I was interviewing for the job at Logitech, I kept getting rejected. And the reason why is the recruiters are screening me out because I had never worked for a big company. So when I finally met with Bracken, I had to go around him and to go around to everybody else. He's like, "Why wouldn't I hire you?" I said, "Well, I've never done this before. I'm not even sure I'll be successful. I'm not even sure I'll like it." As it turned out, I was very successful, and I did like it. But I think there were a lot of people who thought, "Well, how does someone take their startup experience and apply it to a big company?" I think I showed that I was able to do that. I think the other thing that I learned is that it's the same skills. You build a coalition, you set a clear vision, you hire great people and talent, um, and then there's this combination of relentless execution. Because at the end of the day, I love this expression that um, the vision without execution is a hallucination. Like you have to actually do something and innovate. But then there's a weird balance in that you need to be patient. So within a large organization, as you know, if you push too hard, you get rejected as an antibody and they push you out. So you have to be able to push, but know when you're pushing too far. And I think that was one of the skills that I really learned at a large company that maybe more valued and more important than being at a pure entrepreneurial venture.
So a shout out goes out to Bracken Darrell, whoever now thought who's that Bracken you're talking about. And Bracken is so that's why I'm thankful to him, and that shout out goes out to him. Without him, we probably would never met because at that time at Siemens, where I've been in that responsibility, there was a little technical issue where he just said, "Well, you need to talk to Scott," and Scott is making a solution on that, and it was indeed. So I think the technicians tried out for a couple of weeks, and then had been the two of us talking, and a week later the problem has been solved. So thanks, Bracken.
And I think it was a great example of how I think about entrepreneurship within a big company. So Bracken got this call, and then I said, "Give me the number." And then I called 5 minutes later, and I think the reaction was, "I just got off the phone with Bracken. What? Like, I'm not used to that." So I think it's an example, I think, of how even within a large company, for people who are listening, there are behaviors you can deploy that are startup like, but even not being at a startup, that I think will go a long way. It's showing that you care, showing that you're fast, showing that you're responsive, showing that you can be trustworthy.
Definitely. That leads perfectly to the next question, I guess, Antje,
Yes,
right?
exactly. Yeah, Rainer already mentioned it, but you're now a four-time entrepreneur. What does that mean in practice? Is each company a fresh start, or do you carry something forward every time?
Yeah, I think, well, so this is number 5 for me now at Tandem PV. I would say, I think here's where people make a mistake. They take the template of what was successful for them and then they just apply it completely. They hire the same team, they hire the same strategy. And I think what I find is the things that really resonate with you are values and knowing how to work with people. Those things don't change, but every circumstance is different. So if you just apply the same template, I think a lot of people crash and burn. I think the classic example for me is there are many startups founded by people here in Google in Silicon Valley, and a lot of them fail. You go, why? The Google people are so smart, right? They are smart, but they think that what worked in Google is going to work in another template. A lot of times it doesn't, but they don't realize that with Google, you have unlimited money and brand and power. You don't have a lot of these things at a startup. So they think they're going to win it over just by brute force of smarts. And a lot of times it doesn't work. So I think as an example of Tandem PV, I've taken some of my ideas and templates, and I think some of them are actually useful because I haven't been in the energy industry for decades. So you can apply ideas from different industries that work. But the other thing I'm proud of that I've done here is I haven't brought over anyone from Logitech. Like I basically built another team from scratch, and that's harder. But I think the team that I've hired has more appropriate experience to what I'm doing here. than a Logitech. So I think you try to take the things that work for you, the values and some of the ideas, and then I think you need to adapt to the new environment. And I think the people who throw everything out are missing something. The people who try to apply their old template, usually they fail.
I love that because in particular, talking about fails, what have you failed at? I mean, just a straightforward question. And what did you learn? Maybe you probably couldn't have learned without failing, and maybe just not the other way around.
I remember at startup number 3, I was having a post-mortem discussion with my wife, Mariette, and I think she was questioning how much I internalized from the failures, and I said, I could write a whole book about all the failures that I've had. There's so many. And then I was going on and on and on about how many times that I failed. I mean, some of the big ones are, I early in my career, I tend to fall in love with technology and be too early. And I think being too early is just as bad as being too late. Now I had the patience that things like voice over IP and video conferencing eventually became very successful. But when I started, they were very small and they weren't even cutting edge, they were bleeding edge. So I think I started too early. I like to think now in solar, I'm kind of at the right timing of it. Whereas when I started in solar, I did my MBA internship literally 3 decades ago. Wow, was I too early? So I maybe had the right idea, but another example of being too early. Um, and then, I mean, sometimes I've had a couple of instances where you know that you should pivot, like you have the wrong idea, um, but you don't pivot. And I think part of it is a couple times I knew in my gut that I was wrong, but maybe reluctant to make a change for a variety of reasons. So now when I feel that I'm making a bad decision, I change a lot faster. And I think that's true both of strategies, but also people. I think a lot of us have this experience where you have to let someone go, and you know that you should have done it way faster. I just move a lot faster now than I used to. I'm a lot more confident that you just go. Nobody usually says, "Wow, I fired that person too quickly." Or almost never. And I'm sure there's more, but those are a few good examples.
No, but that's amazing examples, and I'm particularly smiling, and Antje knows already what's coming up next because we've just literally had such kind of a situation where I, after just 2.5 weeks, took the decision to just end the contract with the person, and that was exactly the right thing. And I asked myself a couple of times, should I have waited? Should I have just given it another second or third chance? No, I shouldn't have. It's exactly what I did was the right thing to do. And if a decision has to be taken, then a decision has to be taken, and it doesn't make a difference whether you take it then in 6 months or in 12, but you need to take it. And so, but let's just stick with technology. And as you've said it, you've partly fallen maybe too early in love with technology. I think in that part, in particular now in the solar industry, you're perfectly in timing. And let's stick a bit more into that technology because from my point of view, it's just generally fascinating. We're talking about perovskite silicon tandem cells. So for those of you not knowing that, 28% efficiency today, targeting 30% plus. And in plain language, this is the future. And now the question goes to you, Scott, and probably you can explain to our listeners what's behind that and what's so different and why that matters and why this hasn't been done before at scale.
Yeah, so perovskites are a new, they're a crystalline structure. If you would go 600 kilometers down into the center of the Earth, more than 90% of the Earth's crust are perovskites. They're very, very common. Now, what we're doing is we're not mining or we don't use any rare earth minerals. We basically build it synthetically using off-the-shelf chemicals in a lab to build perovskites. Now, what's exciting about it is that it's for a solar panel, it's 200 times thinner than an existing silicon panel. So it's literally 1/100th the width of your hair. It's 1 micron thick. Um, so on a full solar panel, what we're adding is 2 grams of a liquid, and that in and of itself generates 40% more power. And as I said, it doesn't use any rare earth metals or minerals or mining, so it can be made locally, whether it's in the United States or in Europe. And part of the secret is we're taking the existing supply chain of a silicon solar panel. So essentially, it's 2 pieces of glass. You have these silicon cells and then glue and stuff in between. I'm oversimplifying it. And what we do is we coat the top glass that you already have, and that adds 40% more power. So the combination of those 2 things captures more light than the silicon panel itself. So we're not only adding more power, but we're complementing the existing silicon infrastructure. So we're not really competing against it. And when we started this discussion, we were at 28%. We're now nearly at 30%. So we keep adding um, more efficiency, and I expect that we'll break 30 in the coming months. Which is, I told my team, like, nobody remembers the person who ran the 406 mile. It's, you got to break the 4-minute mile, and for us, it's the 30%, uh, which are very close to breaking. The other thing I think is interesting from an economics point of view is that the cost of a solar panel now is so cheap that it's actually not the biggest driver in the cost overall for solar development. So about 75% of the cost is not the panel. So it's the labor, it's the land, it's the balance of systems around it. So by having a higher efficiency panel, we can actually be much cheaper overall for solar deployment. So part of what we're doing is not only innovating and driving the cost down the panel, but we're really innovating around all the costs that drive the costs, especially in Europe and the US, where labor and land is actually quite expensive. And labor and land is becoming more expensive, and the technology is becoming less. So over time, the most important way to drive down the cost of energy is to really make something that's higher density. And that's what we're doing. So I think it has implications for the entire world, just to make energy not only cheaper, um,
Absolutely.
but more ubiquitous.
Yeah, definitely, without any doubt. And I mean, in particular, the independence, as you've just said it, you don't need to have rare materials, rare minerals, which are mostly just provided by China to 99.9%. So we can just drive things much more sovereign than what it has been in the past. So that's making a big difference. But in a bit of a skeptical way, that's still somehow a lab topic, or is it already on commercial scale?
Yeah, so the 30% we've generated is on the lab scale, so it's about the size of a tablet. What we did is we raised about $50 million about a year ago, and we used that to build a demonstration pilot size factory. So it's fairly big. It's over 6,000 square meters or 65,000 square feet. So it's a pretty big factory. And some weeks back, we achieved the biggest milestone that we needed to do on the technology side, where we showed we can go from small R&D scale to large scale. So roughly about 60 times larger. That was where a lot of the skeptics said, "All right, can you translate that?" And we did. So it was a huge milestone that we've done since we even started talking. And I don't think you were aware of that, but that was a huge milestone that we overcome.
That's amazing to hear. And I mean, that makes it much more tangible now for everyone who's interested in talking to that. And by the way, already to our listeners, we'll link Tandem PV and your LinkedIn profile as well, Scott, in the show notes down below. And if you are interested in learning more what that's all about, you'll find more information in the show notes.
So you have now raised 83 million in total. That's amazing. So VC, debt, and government funding, including the Department of Energy and the California Energy Commission. You were also named one of Times Magazine top green tech companies of 2025. What does that fundraising journey tell you about where investors' appetite really sits right now? So between climate conviction and economic pragmatism, or where?
Well, as the listeners might imagine, the fundraising environment continues to be challenging for private companies, especially
Hmm.
for ones that are not doing AI. So if you're following the venture funding, almost all the money is with the giant sucking sound going to AI companies. So if you're still doing things like climate or, heaven forbid, hardware and manufacturing, which most venture capitalists don't like, that tends to be pretty challenging. So I think it's a vote of confidence what we're doing. I think it also speaks to the fact that what we're trying to do is not have a company that's based on a green premium where we're relying on people just paying more because it's cool or green. But we're relying on fundamental capitalist instincts of making it cheaper and allowing people to be greedy and make more money. And part of the reason why I focused on this opportunity, as opposed to maybe going into government or nonprofit organizations, I think one part of my skill set is being an innovator. And I think what I saw an opportunity here is there was this technology, but unless you have somebody who can bring a team and bring it all together, it doesn't happen by magic. It happens by innovation and execution. And then what I liked about it is well, a few things. If you think about how do you solve climate change? Well, a lot of the world needs to be electrified. Most of that is going to be solar energy. And all the experts in the industry agree that perovskites are going to be the future of solar. So in many ways, I looked at this and said, this is the tip of the spear of solving climate change. In fact, when I was near the end of negotiating for this role, my wife said to me, she goes, "Don't you want to look at anything else? You could be a public company CEO, or I mean, certainly probably make more money nominally." And I said, "No, because this is my mission. This is what I want to do." And then I would say part of what I liked about it is, as I said, it's not a green premium, so we're going to win based on just having something that is cheaper, which is usually how I think these innovations diffuse into the marketplace. It's not, some people will buy it because it's better. Most people won't. So if you can have the combination of being cheaper and better for the world, like that's a killer combination.
Yes.
100% agreed. And I mean, that just completely drives it out of that left green woke corner, which a lot of people are tending, at least if it comes to renewables. But exactly as I said, this is a pure economical decision, and it doesn't make a difference whether you believe in climate change or not, whether you think it's a hoax or not. Doesn't make a difference, because the cheapest way of creating energy is the cheapest way of creating energy, and doesn't matter how. So just as a follow-up question, how do you tell maybe person who is in Europe and might be interested in investing in tandem PV, why you're not building things in Germany or the Netherlands, which is traditionally, at least, or had been in the past, the innovation spearhead if it came to solar world? Not anymore, but you're building it in the US.
Yeah, I think a lot of that is due to the US public policy. So I think there's a conventional wisdom that with the Trump administration and the latest OB3 bill, that they remove the incentives. And it's actually not true. So what is true is they did remove the consumer incentives around putting solar on your home and electric cars. But what they did maintain is 100% of the manufacturing credits. So the Republicans voted for 100% of what the Democrats did, and that's through 2032. So from a manufacturing point of view, believe it or not, the US is the cheapest and most cost-effective place to manufacture in the world for solar, even cheaper than China when you factor in the incentives. And what I would say is, for Europe, what Europe has taken a choice of basically having unfettered access to Chinese technology. And the consequence of that is that European solar industry on the manufacturing side is essentially wiped out. And what I would say is, I think one mistake that I think the Europeans are making is they're confusing free trade with overall with fair trade. And I think what you've seen time and time again is that the Chinese have sold below market. They go in and destroy a market, and then they're going to go in and raise prices and take over market share. Now, if a German company did that, they would be immediately uh, prosecuted for being rapacious
Most
and
likely.
violating antitrust laws. But because it's so-called free trade, then it's okay. I think the second thing is that the mistake that the U.S. is making right now, we'll see if it gets rectified in the coming days, but they're trying to put tariffs on everything. And what I would argue is, you don't need to protect our countries from having couches coming in. That is not strategic. But probably, I think there's a consensus about energy, military, drugs and pharmaceuticals, food. Those are probably areas where I think we can all agree that even if you paid a higher price, it's probably better to have that locally to some extent, and let everything else be free trade. And I think Europe knows that they made a mistake with, they said there's this nice guy called Vladimir, and he's giving us some cheap gas. What could go wrong? We could trust him. So that didn't really work out so well. Um, the same thing is now happening with the Chinese, where it's even worse because they're providing almost all of Europe's solar and wind, and can cut it off at any time. So I would say, I think if Europe wanted to learn something from the US experience, I think, yeah, in certain circumstances like energy, you do want to have enough tariffs and maybe incentives to produce it locally. So my expectation is that at some point we will produce locally in Europe. I think Germany just passed a law that has some incentives for companies like ours to be able to manufacture there. And I think that is going to be what's required to be able to do that. If it's unfettered dumping, then we won't do it there. We'll go to wherever is more friendly. And right now, the friendliest place in the world, believe it or not, is the United States for manufacturing clean tech.
And this is a wonderful statement, which takes me to the situation we are particularly talking to you now, being in the Bay Area in San Francisco in the US, because I don't want to destroy all those bridges. What we just currently see in the politics and in the daily news, with exactly as you said it, that 15% traded and taxes and tariffs and everything else, that has the tendency to separate and split the old world and the new world, and to split the US with Europe and the others. It's something like against each other, and it shouldn't be that. It should should be something together. We should be driving things together. But still, let me just get back to that aspect, because you mentioned it just recently. You would like to take back U.S. leadership in solar, which is a bold frame. But is that realistic to reshore the whole solar manufacturing, or is that just made in America as a narrative more on the political aspect than the practical?
Well, I think the mistake that some people are making, and I was at a dinner with some politicians last week, is that they want to reshore it and fight the old battle that the U.S. and the West has lost. So China today in the silicon solar side controls up to 98% of the supply chain. You're not going to win that battle. That's the old battle that is lost. The new battle is to leapfrog. It's to go with perovskites, where it's a completely new material science and it's better and cheaper. That's the battle that I'm fighting. I think that is realistic to reshore. The analogy I gave to this politician, it'd be like saying, we want more rotary dialed phones in our houses. Mobile phones, nah, we don't need to do that. Or rotary phones, that's the future. Like, come on, coal and like, let's not go backwards. So I think this is an opportunity both for Europe and the United States to focus where we can leapfrog on this new perovskite technology and then take ownership of that. But I think fighting the old war against China and silicon, I don't think that will work.
And I agree with you. So let's just quickly stick with the political situation we're currently in, with exactly as I said it already, the one big beautiful bill, and with cuttings which now I've learned didn't even affect you being a manufacturer, but more on the private household. But how is the current situation in the US and in politics affecting you as a US based solar manufacturer? Is that something which is a threat or even an opportunity, or maybe both?
I think what's so interesting is there's the perception of the threat, and then certainly the rhetoric doesn't help. And I think that dampens the mood for people who might want to invest because they hear that. The reality is actually very different. So I told you about the manufacturing credit. There's also a perception that the deployer credit went away, which is also not true. So what most of the deployers have done in the US is there's a safe harbor um, part of the law that says if you deploy 5% of your project, you can basically get the credits for the next 4 years. So that's until 29 and 2030. That's going to be well into the next presidential administration. So even on that side, and there's a 10% tax credit bonus if you deploy an American-made product. And last week there was a ruling by the Treasury Department that says in order to get the credits, you have to have a very high percentage of what they call non-FIA, foreign entity of concern, which is just a code word for China, South Korea and like North Korea and Russia, but they don't make solar panels. So it's really China. So there's a combination of policies that are really quite positive for us. And I think the proxy for that to show that without believing me is that the leading company in the US is called First Solar. They have a $25 billion market cap. Their stock has gone up more than 100% since this bill passed. So clearly the stock market thinks that it's really good for US solar manufacturers. So if you don't take my word for it, take the word of the greedy stock market and how they bid up for solar.
I love that. And so, just as a follow up question on that, do you think that tariffs and the current situation can maybe even rebuild domestic manufacturing, not just in the solar world, but in general?
Yeah, what I would love to see is a consensus around tariffs that around those five areas of defense, energy, food, pharmaceuticals, and uh, what's the other those key strategic areas. So I think in the U.S. there is a healthy policy of having tariffs to basically reshore and have a supply chain on the energy side and for solar and wind and batteries. So I think it is, it fluctuates up and down, which is never good for businesses for uncertainty. But I think it's strong enough that it allows us and others to be able to make a run at it. Now, I think there's still, for most climate companies in the world, there's this idea of the valley of death and the missing middle, where you can get R&D money, you can get money to scale once you've all proven it. Once you're trying to scale it up, that's very difficult. Fortunately for us, we raised that money, so I think we've gone through most of the valley of death. I think it's harder for others. I would like to see more public policy in Europe and in North America on that, but I think for us, we're almost close to the other end where we can start scaling up profitably.
Amazing to hear.
Let's talk about Davos. So you are back in Davos this January. So your fifth year in a row on stage. You spoke at the UN Davos Summit on ESG Technology Solutions panel alongside Dr. Oliver Krause and Eric Schäfer, hosted by Mark Turrell. But you described the mood in Davos not as a spirit of dialogue, the official WEF theme, but as a spirit of destabilization. So That is a strong phrase. What did you feel like in the room?
Well, I think one of the most common discussion points was just about one person, and we all know who that is. And it really dominated all the discussions. And I think it was partly this idea, and I think Mark Carney from the Prime Minister of Canada captured it. This is not a transition, this is a rupture and a fundamental change. And I think a lot of the discussion, especially among the Europeans, but I think it's not limited to them, was that the US is going to be more of a transactional partner and can't be trusted in the long term. And even if there's a new election, because it tends to swing back and forth, there's a sense that Europe needs to kind of stand on their own. I don't think that's necessarily a terrible thing to have Europe take control more of their national security. Um, but it obviously is upsetting to me and a bunch of other Americans who feel very strongly about the European partnership that we have. And I think the other thing that I observed is that there was this split between, all right, I can't trust the government, um, but I can trust some of the people because of the cultural affinity. And also just distinguishing there are some people, hopefully I'm included in that, where people build up a reputation of trust and have a shared cultural affinity as opposed to the government. And then I think some people could really compartmentalize that and say, well, I can still work with American companies as trusted partners, even if I have to be very careful about the politics and the administration of it.
And let's just stick with that. And exactly as I said, there is one person, one actor who is always part of every conversation without being named. But on Davos, you described the US as now being perceived as an unreliable bully and spoken in the same breath as China and Russia, maybe even. So, what was the reaction when you said that out loud on the stage?
I mean, for a lot of my fellow Americans, it's embarrassment because we don't want to be seen as a bully and unreliable, and I think that's a big change from the historical norms. But I think we have to acknowledge that just is where we are as a country, and there are many of us who hope that we can become more reliable. But that's kind of where we are today. I'd say what was interesting on the European side is it wasn't it wasn't expressed as an anger so much as just like you get through the levels of grief, whatever they are, the 5 stages of grief, where they're at the end of it, where they're like, well, it's just the way it is, and I just need to change my behavior accordingly. And I'm not mad or angry. I just need to move on and come up with a different approach. I think that was an interesting transition over my time at Davos, where there was a shock. I don't think it's a shock anymore. It's more a matter of, yes, the world is different and we need to behave differently, and let's go do it.
Thanks for saying.
Yeah, was there a conversation in a hallway or a side event that stayed with you, something that didn't make it into your article?
Yeah, I think the one that I was thinking about that, I would say for me as someone in Silicon Valley, and I eat, sleep, and breathe AI because that's what me and all my friends talk about all the time and invest in companies and startup companies. I'm just struck by the difference in perception between what is happening here in Silicon Valley and the perception of it in the rest of the world, especially Europe. So my view on that is this is just moving so much faster than much people think. And quite frankly, even I did maybe 6 months ago. Um, Whereas when you go to Europe, or last week I was on the East Coast of the US, I think there's still this idea of either a very high level concept of AI or, yeah, it's like this spell checker and it's not very good. And which is completely wrong. And maybe it was true 2 years ago, but I mean, there are a whole bunch of things now that I think when you have AI basically writing all of its own code and recursively updating itself without any human intervention, which is I think where we are now in early 2026, it's just moving so much faster. And I think outside of Silicon Valley, I think people are talking about bubbles. My own view is kind of contrary to that. I do not think we're in a bubble. I think that the difference between the dot-com era and now is in the dot-com era, people were deploying dark fiber around the world, but nobody was using it. In this case, as soon as all the NVIDIA chips are deployed, it immediately gets soaked up by usage. So I still think we're in the beginning of the AI deployment, and that is not conventional wisdom because most people are like, oh, they just extrapolate out from where we were before. But I think they're missing how much value AI is already providing. And this is where people are using it for free at $20 a month. Can you imagine it? Once it starts getting to the point where it can sufficiently replace or augment some workers, I expect that we'll look at $1 trillion a year in CapEx and go, well, that was pretty small in a $125 trillion a year economy. So I think people are grossly misunderstanding and underestimating the impact. And there are a whole bunch of downstream consequences to that. But I did not write about that in my article, and I think that's one of the things that struck me over the last couple of weeks.
And that's definitely something which we could have, I think, a complete separate episode about, which is definitely something we might come up with later this year. And I agree with you. I think the speed currently is just insane, and maybe one of the reasons why, and I can agree with you, what your feeling is. I think we're underestimating the influence which it's been taken, probably because it's overwhelming, probably because people are already overwhelmed with the amount of changes in the world and with the insecurity and with a war here in Europe at least, and all that aspects. And if you combine things, and you're not in technology like we are, that might be just simply completely overwhelming. And then the typical human behavior starts to kick in, that people are declining and just close their eyes and don't look left and don't look right and just try to focus on what they're able to understand. And that might be then the translator tool, which doesn't work sufficient. So
I think that's true, and I would add to it that I don't think we've ever seen anything move this fast. Like, we've seen the internet, which took 20 years, and the mobile phone innovation, which we're talking decades. Here we're talking about changes in months. I don't think human beings' brains are wired to understand that.
absolutely agreed. Absolutely agreed. Let's just quickly jump to we are recording now on February 23rd, and it's just a week ago that the Munich Security Conference took place, just around the corner here in Munich. Energy security was one of the most central themes and topics. And in your Davos article, it describes that a European consensus that relying on the US for energy defense and pharmaceuticals and data sovereignty is no longer viable, like it had been never most likely, from dependencies from Russia, but framed not emotionally but pragmatically. These are the new effects. As someone now building US energy sovereignty, do you see the same pragmatic shift happening in American boardrooms?
Uh, I it's a really weird time because you have all this rhetoric about in the U.S. about, hey, we need to have more fossil fuels and nuclear energy from the administration. But let me tell you, let me share some interesting facts. So in 2025, despite all of that rhetoric and kind of negative policy and attention toward the renewables, 88% of all new energy in the United States came from solar, wind, and batteries. So very small. Nuclear was like zero, and then the rest of it was natural gas, pretty much. In the forecast by the U.S. energy industry is that 99% of all new energy in 2026 will come from solar, wind, and batteries. So it's just a complete, disconnect and cognitive dissonance between the rhetoric, which I think a lot of it is culturally driven, and the reality. The other thing is that the leading state in the U.S. now for deploying solar is Texas. So you hear all this negativity from a so-called conservative or Republican point of view, but then they're deploying most solar. Why? Greed. It's cheaper.
It's just simply economical again, yeah. But I can agree with you. I have been in Austin, in Texas, about a year ago, and I have been super much surprised of how much renewables I've been able to spot all over that places while flying into to Austin. So agreed. I mean, that is something you would never expect, but the same is valid for India, for example. I just can remember at my former employment where I've been in India, and I just did find hundreds, thousands of windmills just at the coast shore, and that was something which, yeah, maybe we should just open our eyes and be a bit less biased.
Well, I think it goes back to the point about AI that I made. If when my wife asked me, why are people struggling with this? I go, because if you looked at 5 years ago, none of this was true. Solar wasn't cheaper and batteries were not cheaper. So I think people are still stuck in this mindset of where they were 5 years ago. And it's just moving so fast, it's hard for people to get their heads around that. Even as an example, Pakistan, not the US, not a hotbed of environmentalism, deployed 22 gigawatts of solar last year. So that was half the amount of the United States. And it wasn't driven by any incentives or environmental movements. It was just driven by purely, hey, we can't trust the grid. And by the way, the energy is cheaper. So they were deploying in their own. I think these are all good news things happening around the world in a world where the algorithms are all getting us angry and agitated. You're not hearing all the good news. There's a lot of good news happening on the climate and solar that we don't really hear about. That's one of, I think, many things that I think I could share about the incredible positive and I would argue irreversible momentum to basically get rid of all of our fossil fuels in our lifetime.
So, when you're talking to politicians or investors who are skeptical about the green agenda, what language actually lands?
I think the language that usually lands is today it's shifted away from security a little bit more to affordability. I think there's an affordability discussion happening more in the US, which I think is now trickled out through the rest of the world. And especially, I mean, Europe's been having this discussion for a while because of the cost of energy really going up so much since the Russian gas got curtailed. But in the U.S. now, what we're seeing is because the AI and data center boom is putting pressure on electricity. A lot of the electrical rates are going up, and people fundamentally they may not understand what's going on, and they may not care about the environment, but they don't want to pay more on electrical rates. So the fact that solar is cheaper today means that when I think you're talking to politicians, they don't really care. Most of them don't care about the green part anymore. And a lot of the Democrats are trying to run away from it. I think it was one of your discussions. Like, I don't want to talk about climate change. So let's not talk about it. Let's just talk about lowering prices. And I think this is where solar, wind, and batteries comes into play, and that it is cheaper. So the more of that you deploy, the cheaper it gets. By the way, the more nuclear you deploy, your rates are going to go sky high. In Georgia, where they built the only nuclear power plant in the US in the last 10 years, the rates are out of control because nuclear is not a good solution if you want to make it affordable.
Thank you for that clear words.
Absolutely. So you're visible, outspoken on social media about renewable energy, despite the current political climate in the US. That is not without a risk. What drives you to keep up speaking up?
Well, I think people over-index before on, like I said, on the green side where everything needs to be done for environmental reasons. And even then, I was probably on the other side saying, can we just talk about economics and innovation? Now it's flipped to the other end where you're not even allowed to talk about green or climate change. And I disagree with that either. I think there are many people who are listening here who are going, yeah, we still have a problem. And we not only need to do something about it, but we need to do it faster. So I think I'm trying not to over-index to either side, which is exaggerating for their own purposes. I think we need to roll out cleaner energy to make it lower cost. And yes, we still have a climate change problem that while we're making progress, I think everyone here listening knows it's not fast enough. So part of my personal mission, I want to accelerate that. I think we can't wait 20 years. It's got to be much faster. And I think my personal mission, why did I do this? Why did I leave a great comfortable job where I was making a lot of money and take this risk? Because I felt like somebody has to stand up and do things and kind of and take the charge. And there are many people are doing it. I'm trying to contribute my part to that to speed things up in a way that I know how.
Just in case one of the listeners is wondering why I do like that person, Mr. Scott Wharton, that much, now you have the answer. So we need to have people stand up and do things and execute and not just talk about it. Have you faced any kind of backlash from investors or partners or customers based on that? Clear statements?
Well, I think the investors who don't want to invest in us because they don't believe in climate change probably won't do it. So I think there are enough investors who believe in that. But having said that, I think most of the investors we have, their mission is to make money. They like a double bottom line. So I think most of them are investing because they think we're going to be a great capitalist return, as do I. I mean, I've been telling people, not only am I excited about this because we're going to solve climate change, but I think this is going to be the best company in return that I ever worked for. I truly believe that. Why? Because the solar market and the energy market is so much bigger than video conferencing or anything that I've ever done. It's just going to have a bigger impact.
That's without a doubt. And maybe that is a very good positive aspect, which I would love to share with European leaders. What would you say to an European executive who looks now to the US in 2026 and may think they've given up on climate and that's anyhow gone? We don't have to do anything anymore.
Ignore the rhetoric. Look at the results. The results are speak much louder than the noise. The noise is just noise. Ignore it. Look at the signal. The signal is the 99% of new energy being deployed as clean energy. That's what's actually happening. Ignore the culture wars and the headlines. They're just wrong.
So
Thank you.
let's jump back and talk about Germany again, sorry, because Rainer and I live here and we also work here, and the German solar story is generally painful. So Germany led the world in solar, then dismantled it through subsidy cuts, and is now struggling again with bureaucracy. What's your honest assessment of what went wrong and what should Germany do differently?
Well, I think the irony is, so Germany relied naturally on Russia and their kindness and the natural gas. And now guess what? Now you're relying on the kindness and of the U.S. LNG coming in. And we've already talked about the fact that you're trading one risky situation for another. Um, Interestingly, I think there's a perception also that solar doesn't work in northern Germany or northern Europe, and it's completely untrue. I'll just give you a couple of stats. The two countries that have the highest per capita solar in the world are the Netherlands and Hungary. Very similar geographies to Germany. So here's another stat. In London, where they're not known for having their sunny days, you get about
True.
50% of the sunshine is LA. So the sun's still shining even when it's cloudy out. Otherwise, all the plants would die. I think we inherently know that, but we kind of forget about that. So solar can work everywhere in the world. It works obviously better if you're in New Mexico or Saudi Arabia, but it works pretty well in Europe. So what I would say is, one, continue the incentives to deploy things. And two, I think it is important for Germany and Europe to have their own sources. Right now it's almost 100% relying on China for solar and the U.S. for LNG. Don't do that. How do you get away with that? I think the U.S. through the Biden administration, but now actually continued, ironically, in the Trump administration, is there are incentives for fossil fuels. Probably hard to get rid of them because of politics. I think taxes. I think what I learned from the Biden administration, I had dinner with Jennifer Granholm, who was the former Secretary of Energy for the U.S. government. She said, you know what they learned is that taxes don't work because people don't like taxes, but incentives work just as well. And I think that was one of the brilliance of the IRA, is that providing incentives rather than try to tax people, it creates the same behavior. I think Europe has forgotten about that. I think it has been a success in the U.S. Could be better, but I think Europe needs their own solar and wind, and they need their own indigenous industries just to protect themselves. Even if it's a little more expensive, I think it's okay.
Totally agreed. And maybe just stick with that questionnaire and the straightforward type of a thing. And now I don't have to put, I think, the explicit switch within that podcast. But what's the most bullshit excuse you hear from executives and politicians on each side of the Atlantic when it comes from climate action or energy transition? The answer you're tired of hearing.
Well, there's so many. We've already talked about the cost one. I would say the one I'd like to focus on is solar energy is not a baseline power because it's intermittent. We need nuclear and we need fossil fuels for baseline. Let me share with you what happened 2 weeks ago in California. So 2 weeks ago in California, the state went 43 hours without burning any fossil fuels for electricity. 0. And it was all on solar, wind, and batteries. Now, what that tells you is, well, California is not like a small country like Denmark. It's the 4th largest economy in the world. And it just showed you in 2026, it can be a baseline power. And it just didn't happen in the peak of the summer when we had the most sun. It happened in the winter in February. So the story's only going to get better. So I think what's happening and what most people miss is that solar is getting cheaper. Batteries are getting much cheaper. They're down actually 60% in the last 2 years. Again, it's a thing that people can't keep their heads around. And the durations are getting longer. So the combination of the flywheel, batteries plus solar, and maybe in Northern Europe, what I'd say is if you have wind, which blows more in the winter, we can have baseline power with 100% renewables, and we will have it in a decade. It's not that far off. I think it's a complete bullshit story that we need nuclear and all this other stuff. The other thing that's interesting is the reason why fossil fuels are going to go away in the next 5 to 10 years on the electrical grid is that they need more than 50% capacity utilization. Otherwise, they're uneconomical. Now, solar already in the middle of the day in the whole world makes fossil fuels uneconomical. They literally shut it down. Now, as the batteries continue to get better and expand, most of these fossil fuel plants are hitting below the 50% threshold, of which they don't make money. And when they don't make money, they need to shut down. And that is happening even faster. So I think we're getting to a point where in the very near future, you can just oversubscribe your solar and your batteries and a little bit of wind for portfolio. And maybe you get a little natural gas for extreme backup, but that's it. You're done. And it's a complete bullshit thing that it's true it's intermittent, but that's why we have batteries to kind of store it when we don't when the wind is not blowing and the sun is not shining. And it's already happened in California, like I said, 43 hours. And we are at the very early days of kind of making that happen. So that's complete bullshit.
Thanks for that, and thanks for pointing to California as well. Maybe we should do some kind of a trade example, and maybe we should trade Greenland with California. So that might be a good idea. You could get part of Europe, and Greenland could get part of the US. I mean, Trump anyhow wants it, so anyhow, we shouldn't go that way.
California
Scott,
just did a deal with Denmark and with the UK and Germany. So California, I think most people in Europe don't realize how strong and independent the states are in the U.S. And I think it's not a bad idea. It's possible. Not everything
Absolutely.
needs to go through Washington D.C.
yeah, sorry. So, Scott, just one more question. So, if you could introduce one policy tomorrow globally, what would it be?
Well, I think, like I said earlier, I think the economists for a long time have been talking about a carbon tax, and I think what I've realized, most people realize that people hate taxes around the world, and in an ideal world, we would get rid of subsidies for fossil fuels, and we would have this carbon tax. We don't live in an ideal world, so I think the idea of not fighting that politically, the politically smart thing is to be able to also provide some support for renewables, so that people make those choices, so we can transition faster. I think that's probably the smartest way to do it. I think the U.S. had a smart policy that is still working. I think Europe can learn from that as well. And then the second thing is, I would say, take these strategic industries, not all industries, but I think it's okay to have some selective industries where you do have some control over it, where you're not reliant on other people for things like food and energy and drugs or defense, and own some of that. And I think we had an idealistic view of the world that we could trust everybody at any time, and I think we're getting over that. So I think a more pragmatic approach is, yes, I think Europe needs to have many of their own sources, which they don't, in energy, they don't today. I think that could be fairly easily rectified with some smart public policy.
Thank you for that. And I hope there was a couple of people listening right now and maybe taking an example on that and building that policy. But let's just, as we are already in 52 minutes and we're running close to our end, we do have two traditions. The first one is every guest brings a song and one track that captures something essential in your journey, your energy, your moment of conviction. Anything you would like to add to our playlist? What would be your song and why?
Well, in the honor of the spirit that you picked everything is very timely. I've been listening to the new U2 album that just dropped, and I love the new song "American Obituary" because it just speaks to the fact that for all the faults that the U.S. has, which it has many, I think there's a feistiness and a spirit of rebirth that is also happening in parallel to all these other things that I haven't seen probably since the 1960s, which is also rising up in parallel. And I love the idea of just not giving up and giving in to that the world is a bad place, that we can all do things. So I like that song. And I like the fact that you don't have to just say, I can't talk about anything. Like, I don't agree with that. So, and I think if we can all agree on, well, let's fight for democracy and freedom and other things like that, doesn't need to be a political or partisan thing. Like it's a human value. And I think that's what that song speaks to, is it's not a partisan thing. It's about human values and freedom, which I'm enjoying listening to. I also like the idea that U2, even in their late 60s, they're still continuing to innovate and show that they're not out of it yet. You can still be productive and innovative and feisty even as you get older. It doesn't have to only be young people.
That I love the message behind. And if we can play a little bit of a role to just keep the connection between the US and the old world here in Europe, I'm very much happy that we have been able to. Thank you for that.
Thank
Thank you.
you. And we always end with our 1 day in transformation challenge. So, something our listeners can actually do in the next 7 days, giving everything we've talked about today. So, what's yours for them? In the last episode, greetings to Christina. She suggested that we should be brave and talk to a stranger. I have to admit that I didn't really go outside much over the weekend because of the weather and didn't meet any strangers, but the challenge is still on top of my list. What about
Yeah,
you,
so
Rainer?
there was a book that really influenced me a while back. It's by a guy named Tim Ferriss, and he wrote a book called The 4 Hour Work Week, but it really wasn't about that. It was really about how to live your life. And one of the things that he talked about was that people usually overestimate the risk of something they do and they take. And a lot of times, I think if you ask yourself the question, well, what's the worst thing that could happen if I do this? Usually the answer is not very much. And so I think for me, like that book inspired me to both travel around the world, go work at Logitech, start companies, because I realized the worst thing in the world that could happen is I go back and do my last job before. That wasn't so bad. And it even inspired me to come to Tandem PV, where even though I gave up a lot, it kind of forced me to get out of my comfort zone and do something new, which I'm really excited about. Whereas I think a lot of times it's very easy to be comfortable. It's hard to break out of that. I had this one experience where I was doing this workshop at Logitech, and they had this exercise where we woke up at 4 a.m. and we were going to go swimming in the Pacific Ocean off of the coast of Malibu. And I remember the night before, I was like, oh, so cold and I'm gonna be tired and I don't know what we got. Like I was just dreading it the whole night. And then you put your wetsuit on and you're freezing your tail off in the winter. And then we got out there and we swam out almost a kilometer off of the shore and we watched the sunrise. And I remember thinking, God, I'm so glad I did this for all of the whinging. Like of course I didn't want to do it, but then when I got out there, it was great. I feel the same way about being a Tandem PV. Like I took a risk. I gave up a lot, but now that I'm doing it, like I feel really good about it. I think there are many things in our lives where we go, oh, I'm just not, I just don't want to do it because I'm comfortable. And usually I think the conclusion is if you get over that and you do dive in the metaphorical cold water, it actually feels pretty good, but you got to jump in. So I'd encourage everybody, whatever the thing it is that they're sitting on the couch and they're feeling warm and cozy and they don't want to jump it, go dive because you're going to feel better about it after you do it.
Love
I like
that.
that.
And we are perfectly in the right time to do exactly this. It's anyhow the time of transformation, and a lot of things are changing in the world at the moment. So therefore, jump out and do something different. So with that, Antje, I've got so many ideas. Should we move maybe to Silicon Valley and join Tandem PV? Maybe it requires hard print in tandem solar cells. I don't know. Or maybe we should lobby the German government and stop killing its own solar industry again. Or we should probably start a band and do some music called the perovskite power. I don't know. Maybe we just install solar panels in my garden, declare energy independence from the grid, and yeah. What do we do tomorrow, Antje?
Same thing we do every day, Rainer. Try to make the world a little less dependent on fossil fuels and authoritarian regimes for its energy. Help Scott and Tandem PV prove that you can build world-class solar technology in America. And that saying so loudly in 2026 still counts as courage. Also, definitely not the band yet.
Okay. But well, Scott, thank you so much for the technology, for the clarity, for the reminder that Davos was not, in fact, the peak of either of our careers. It was just an electrical situation, and an amazing speech with you. Thank you very much for your time, and thanks for being our guest. And I am pretty sure you'll be back throughout the year and we'll have a lot of things to talk about. Thank you so much.
I'd love to be back. Thank you for the thoughtful discussion. Till next time.
Thank you.